I'm Anna Spencer. Okay, let's go global today, shall we? I don't know which country to start with because I got folks all over the place. I guess in California, I've got Robert Schaefer, who's a very old friend who I got to know because I liked his work on separatism. But now he's doing work on globalization also. And the two questions are, I guess you could say, is the world fragmenting or is it coming together? And he's got an opinion on that. In Kiev, in Ukraine, we have Andrei Kamenshikov, who has just got home from Moscow. His family and he have always lived in Moscow, and now he lives in Kiev and does peace work. And he sort of knows Yeshua Moser Poingsuan, who is in Victoria, BC now, because Yeshua has been part of something called Nonviolence International, both of them working in very different parts of the world, but running peace programs there. And Yeshua was largely in Southeast Asia and has lived in Thailand a good part of his life. I always tend to put Doug Saunders last because I kind of tend to think of him as a co-host. He's always with me, and I wouldn't know what to do without him. And he is a international affairs man for the Globe and Mail, and a good guy. So we're going to talk about globalization first, because just a little while ago, Robert said something that kind of surprised me. It was just not that it's a new idea, but that it was so, he put it in such a flat-footed way. He said, globalization's over. Okay, that's pretty definitive statement. So he's been writing a book about that. And I think Robert, do you want to defend your argument?
Sure. So I'm just finishing a book. It's called After Globalization, Crisis and Disintegration. It'll appear in the fall with Routledge. So I've been working on globalization for a long time, and basically it's the history of the origins of contemporary globalization, which is 1980 or so. I mean, the world economy and stuff has been globalizing in different ways for a lot longer, but the contemporary phase starts in 1980 or so with the rise of the stock market in the United States. And the stock market becomes an engine of change and basically requires corporate managers to take strategies that will increase profits. So they do mergers and create larger corporations. They outsource and deunionize, so they go to Mexico and then China, and then everybody else starts going around the world. And they introduce new technologies that increase productivity, and those things become the engine of change for globalization and have all these different expressions. The trouble is it creates crises. A whole series, basically a crisis every decade, and then the Great Recession of 2008. And that's a real serious crisis for the system. And it creates a political response to it in the United States, both on the right and the left, and in European countries, Brexit and so on. And it has all these other sort of collateral responses, which have basically undermined the foundations of globalization and have made it and are making it more difficult for corporations to merge. There's antitrust stuff going on in the United States and Europe. Countries and the COVID have disrupted supply chains and outsourcing. China in a trade war, this is more problematic than it was. And productivity actually technology has not improved in the way that people thought. And hasn't been introduced as fast as it might, and so on. So the things that drive this Wall Street globalization forward are being chipped away, and there's a lot of the foundations are being hammered, and to some extent are coming apart. Of course, Trump played a big role in that in the United States in hammering at China and trade deals and at antitrust law and so on. But actually, Biden is continuing those same sort of approaches in the main. So it's become kind of a bipartisan attack on the things that made globalization great.
Good summary but it looks like that is only addressing the economic part of globalization, and maybe that's all you mean by globalization. But for example, the last few days, I've had several conversations with people saying, well, let's hope now that we've had COVID, we've learned our lesson, and that things like health, viruses, as well as global warming and probably a whole bunch of other things, are truly international in scope, truly global, and can't be solved independently by nation states. So maybe we will get back into globalizing. By that, it means something other than what you just talked about in terms of Wall Street.
I think a lot of globalization is good and so on, and I support that. Climate change is a global issue, pandemic disease, hunger and poverty. I think those are. But I think that the people who've been supporting the contemporary uh, sort of push have, they hit a brick wall, and actually the COVID recession actually deepened those difficulties in that regard. So people have to come up with something different or changed or reshape in a way that can create or maintain at least some of the important features of globalization.
We tend to think of it as being sort of a teeter-totter of two poles between globalization and, on the other hand, nationalization of economies and protectionism and autarky. And I wonder if the retreat of one this time necessarily means another. In speaking to what Meta was talking about, there are a lot of forms of interconnectedness that now exist. And I think part of the problem is that before this current wave of economic globalization, the post-1989 wave of offshoring of global supply chains and so on. Before that, we had a world where nations tended to interact with other nations through very singular channels. They had a diplomatic channel, they had a couple of economic channels, and they had tourism to some degree. And what's also happened in parallel with the rise of economic globalization after the end of the Cold War and the commensurate collapse in poverty and all that other stuff, has been that nation states have become much more polyphonic in their relationship with each other, right? I mean, one of the reasons why it's hard to disentangle economies from China, for example, if we're talking about sort of a new Cold War paradigm, is that there are so many different channels of engagement now, including individual citizens all connected to each other, and that sort of thing. And I wonder if, I mean, as Robert says, there's been a measurable retreat of economic globalization since 2008. I mean, offshoring has retreated. The United States went back to industrial manufacturing. A lot of supply chains have deglobalized. And that seems to be a growing trend, partly because countries like China and India have gone in for nationalistic procurement programs. I mean, the Buy America program which we in Canada regard as a very ominous development, preferential national purchasing program. China and India now have identical ones, and it's very hard for anyone looking to export to find a market in another major country nowadays. On the other hand, I don't think we're seeing, with this measurable retreat in economic globalization, I don't think we're seeing a hard fall into nationalist policies. Maybe we saw it a bit in the United States with its approach to vaccines and that sort of thing, but that probably didn't help the United States, so it might have been a negative lesson. So I'm wondering, like, Robert, do you think that the retreat of economic globalization means a rise of old style protectionist nationalism?
To some extent, yeah, I think it probably does. I mean, the part of the premise is there are national policies, right, that you're talking about that try to encourage this, and mercantilist policies. China is a notoriously mercantilist place, and India too, although it has been for decades. I mean, for India, that's nothing new. That they've been doing that for a long time. But then there's private actors or corporations and stuff, and they have and they're, what is their policy and how is it shaped, and what are their reactions? And that's a more complicated story, I think. And it's not automatic. I mean, people are not they're de-outsourcing to China. They're leaving China, but they're not going to Vietnam or somewhere else. So does that really change anything? And if so, how? Some of the ones are coming back, but then they go to Mexico. So it's not clear to me what that's about. The other thing I would say is that, as part of the disintegration part, is that there are some people who are being excluded from the world economy or being marginalized and being left out A lot of Africa is being marginalized, and we're disinterested in what they have economically, and we're not interested in their goods anymore because we can get it somewhere else or in another form, and we're not interested in them politically anymore. So the United States, has basically withdrawn from Africa and as a meaningful place for engagement and globalization. So that's another kind of deglobalization that's happening, I think, is both economic and political, economic disinterest and political indifference to large numbers of countries around the world. And, there's a retraction of U.S. military power and so on that, okay, and, who's going into those places? Well, not many people. I mean, the Europeans are not,
I know.
are excluding
Well, Robert,
Africans.
is there a third possibility, which is a rise of regional and ideologically defined trading blocks slash political blocks? Certainly China with Belt and Road is making an effort with that, which extends into Africa, but also, and Andre can talk about this maybe, is Russia's attempt to create a Eurasian trade and political bloc, which it would like to include Ukraine, and it has certainly put some efforts into Belarus and that sort of thing. Is that what we're going to end up with?
Well, I'd like to hear from Andre what he thinks about that, because I think there is an effort being made to do that.
And for me, it's news to hear that the economic trends of the last decade were actually on deglobalization. I don't. I don't know these statistics, so it's hard for me to tell. And it's hard for me also to imagine how countries like China and India, which are so critically dependent on globalization, yes, they probably want to protect their own market, but I would think that they're more dependent on globalization than almost any other nation in the world. So I find, at least in economic globalization, and having access to other markets and so forth. So I think that, they probably, I find it hard to believe that they can be against that, even though they might be interested in closing their own markets to others. As for Russia, the issue is that Russia's, the views of Russian elite were not really related to and the desires of the Russian leadership to set up this economic union and things like that, were not really motivated by economic concerns as such. They were more related to political and ideological concerns. And as such, many of the efforts that Russia has been making were very counterproductive, because basically the Russian economy is not, in a state where it can be attractive to others, even to many of its neighbors. And while, like, Russia is still experiences a certain inflow of labor migrants from other post-Soviet states, especially Central Asian states, it's not it's not an economic superpower. Its economic has been stagnating for the last decade, and it's probably going to be going down in the future. Its shift starting 2014, starting the events in Ukraine. Well, it actually started before that, but the critical point was 2014, when it shifted from soft power to hard power, to try to force its way. That had, again, a very negative effect and backfired. And so I think that, generally speaking, this concept of a Eurasian Union is actually dead. In fact, this concept wasn't initially a Russian concept. It was a concept that was pioneered in the late 1990s, well, mid to late 1990s, by Kazakhstan President Nazarbayev at the time, who probably felt quite uncertain about the future of Kazakhstan, which is this large country in the middle of Asia with fairly low population density, had about half, the ethnic composition was also about half and half Kazakh and Russian. Well, of course, there were many other ethnic groups as well. So he probably felt at the time that this kind of, Eurasian Union would be a effective concept for him to promote his own agenda and to, maintain Kazakhstan as a key player in the region. But now, then that was taken over by Russia, that put its own views on what the Eurasian Union should be. And at this point, I think that while it formally exists and there are, certain institutions and certain agreements made and all that, and, there's probably a level of economic cooperation regarding customs and other things like that, it is seen today as more that Russia is trying to kind of buy friends or buy in neighboring nations by basically offering some economic benefits to them, but it's not really working as a effective economic unit. And it can't, because it's based around countries with political systems that are not producing effective economic growth.
I don't read things talking about it as an economic project, but it sounds like more, make Russia great again.
That's why I don't think it's feasible, because you can't build something like this effectively without economic base. If it provides effective economic base, then there's a genuine interest for other nations to be part of it. That, like, many nations want to become or became part of the EU, like, in Eastern Europe, for example, because, it was a very attractive concept to them. The Eurasian Union is based imperialist, basically a more, I would say, old kind of imperialist concept, in a new form. And it's not attractive. So what the Russian leadership is doing is it's trying to basically buy, other nations by, providing them with some kind of benefit. So, what that leads to is, it's beginning to be seen by opposition groups in Russia as a union for others at the expense of Russia. It's not based on how to make life better for the people in these different nations, by cooperating.
But it's kind of like Russia, the great hegemon, cultural hegemon.
That's what I want. But the problem is, how do you sell that to others? It's not an attractive way to approach others. There are constant quarrels even between Russia and its closest allies, or at least there's certain tension. Kazakhstan, which I mentioned, for example, just a few years ago, it's decided to move its written language from the Cyrillic to Latin script. This is just one little thing, despite being part of the Eurasian Union and all that, So, because people, and that's largely, I think, a kind of instinctive reaction to the actions of the Russian leadership. And so, they want to make sure that there are certain cultural and maybe less economic, but cultural, gaps, and some ways to, some feeling of identity, that they can use to mobilize their population if Russia decides to play the same game with them as it played with Ukraine. I guess that's
okay. Then, to what extent would you say that China is playing the same kind of game, that is the same model of imperialism, if you will, by trying to reclaim, its role as a hegemon in Tibet, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and even building little islands in the South China Sea, trying to, spread out and take control. Is this the same playbook? Are they working from the same notion or not?
I think there are similarities, but there's also a major difference, and that is that China has been developing economically very successfully. So it has much more to offer. And so, again, I don't know in detail. I mean, I know the general picture, of course, what's going on in Hong Kong and so forth. And I think that's going to backfire because, you know, the events in Hong Kong are awarding to people in Taiwan, you know, so there's probably the idea of any kind of reunification. But
I bet Yeshua has a good guess.
This morning I'm not answering your question, Meta, but maybe I'll get around to it. This morning I was listening to the UN General Assembly debate on right to protect, R2P. And it was falling out along the lines that you would expect with the states that are much more authoritarian not being very happy with the idea. And what was interesting to me was the vast majority of states voted for the resolution. And this is something that we're seeing a bit more in the UN than we ever saw in the past. It used to be if any of the permanent 5 representatives at the United Nations disagreed with something, it just didn't happen. And now we're seeing more and more clusters of states taking things out of the Security Council and taking to the General Assembly. I was monitoring the discussion at the General Assembly because I wanted to see when the Myanmar discussion was going to come up, which is going to come up today at some point in time. And it's going to have some interesting reflections of states. I'm really going to be interested to hear what China has to say on that. Because China and Russia have both been blocking any movement on Myanmar or Burma in the Security Council. Not because they care about Myanmar at all, but they care about the precedent that any action would set for them. They don't have any big interest in that country, even if they are the major seller of weapons to Myanmar. It doesn't mean a whole lot. I mean, if they lost that contract, it's not going to break the bank for either one of them. They're more concerned about the precedent it will set. And the other countries have said, a pox on your house, we're taking it to the General Assembly where we're not under your veto. And I'm seeing that more and more. But during this time of the global pandemic, there has been a lot of unfinished business going around. And we're seeing that in places like Nagorno-Karabakh, Western Sahara, Hong Kong, Myanmar itself, Gaza, states who are feeling unrestrained, which they may have felt more in the past because of the breakdown of multilateralism in the United Nations, to basically feel that they have a free hand and that the world is more occupied with other things right now, like surviving the pandemic. And Taiwan is really scared right now. They're really scared about this because they see China using this opportunity. They watch very closely what it did in Hong Kong. They've been very supportive of the people in Hong Kong. And they're very frightened of the current situation.
Is it game over in Hong Kong?
I don't think it's game over anywhere at this point in time. I don't think we've seen the end of massive changes that are taking place on our planet right now, which are not the fault of the pandemic, really, but the pandemic has just shaken up a whole lot of things. And I don't think we can even see right now some of the results that this is going to have on a massive level on interstate relations.
I just would like to add a few words. I spent a few months actually in Russia. Just came a couple of days ago. And I have a strong feeling that, well, I wouldn't say that it's game over. It's never game over because life continues. But I have a strong feeling that most likely we will see a consolidation of a basically authoritarian dictatorship in Russia, and probably the situation will be frozen in that state for maybe another decade or more. So it seems that basically they're now, in fact, right as we're speaking today, the Russian Parliament is adopting a new law that basically will outlaw will give the authorities the right to legally deny any political rights or any rights to participate in a political process to basically anyone they feel is a threat to them under various pretexts, calling the extremists and so forth. So we're moving in a very bad direction.
I'm just amazed that he can keep getting away with it. And he does seem to be getting away with it. And is there any other, I mean, if you took Putin out of the picture, what would the thing look like? Who else is there that makes any difference?
There's an inner circle of people who mainly came from the military and security institutions. So they're not, they in a sense, it's not the oligarchs anymore. It's not people that, have, it's mainly people. I mean, they are rich. They are de facto oligarchs, all of them, because they have control of the core parts of the country's economy, but they don't come, they're not business-minded people. They're unfortunately people that maintain this old post-Soviet or post-Soviet imperialist, conspiracy theory concepts and all that crap that is clearly and is personally in Putin's head and in the head of the people in this close circle that surrounds him. They have this, concept of the world as a zero-sum game, as if something goes wrong, it's because of someone's conspiracy and things like that. I think many people are at the level that they truly believe in all kinds of crap that they. I think that change might only maybe start coming a decade or so from now, when, first of all, the economy. Today it's stagnating. There are lots of fears that things will go bad because the economy did improve very significantly in the first decade of the century, and while it's not improving much lately, the government is able to maintain the more or less decent level right now, and it will probably be able to do that for quite a while. Until there's a massive shift from economy based on oil, because that still is a key source of income for Russia and especially for the Russian elite. So when that starts changing globally, that will definitely have effect. I was more hopeful. I spent a year, basically in Ukraine, not traveling much due to the pandemic. And so when I finally did travel, it was more than a year since I've been in Moscow and seen things. And I have this feeling that despite growing opposition, despite the fact that the government is becoming less and less popular among the population, they seem to have the means to maintain themselves in power. And while they might be unpopular, their strategy is simple. They have a extensive mechanism for repressions. They don't use them at mass scale, at least so far, because they're not interested in that. But they do use repressions more and more lately, and they also keep the doors open so people can leave. So they can keep the tensions from growing too much, because most people that are dissatisfied end up leaving, and then they're
How much difference did Navalny's adventure make? Going and then coming back and then going to prison, and I guess they've shut down his whole operation now. There's no Navalny organization, so clearly he's lost definitively, right? There's no hope for him. So what did he think might happen?
I don't know what he thought. I don't know what his calculations are, but I think that he's not a person whose actions can be judged based on simply rational calculations. He seems to be a person that, he has certain ideals. He were in his one of his last speeches during the court hearings against him. He spoke a lot about the Bible and his view of view of religion and things like that.
Hmm.
So I think there was a miscalculation. I think they did not realize how far the regime is ready to go. I also think his decision to come back was that he felt that as a politician, he's obliged to be, in Russia if he wants to continue himself to be a key politician in Russia. So, and his return, it was a very strong symbolic statement. It had the symbolic meaning. It clearly put him in a position, in a leadership position, and made him basically, the only real opposition figure to Putin today.
Could he and Khodorkovsky ever form a team? Are they ideologically compatible at all? And I don't know what kind of resources Khodorkovsky has now, but he's alive. He's not in prison.
They have they've been in touch, definitely. Yeah, I don't know personally, maybe not, but the people in the team, and they have cooperated. There are also certain differences between them. There was some critic. I mean, again, before this whole ordeal, of course, Khodorkovsky was at times critical about the actions of Navalny and vice versa. But in this kind of situation, of course, they I think they feel that they're on the same boat in a sense. But of course, Khodorkovsky is not. He's not seen as a leader. His words are maybe interesting to hear to people, but he's not seen as a opposition leader, like Navalny. And that's people in Navalny's team have more of a potential in that sense of really becoming leaders. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem that it seems that once Navalny has been locked in prison, it seems that so far there's no one that can really replace him effectively as in his position. I think the best option would be if it would be possible to, in some kind of deal to get him out of the country, exchange him for something like that. The question is, would he, even if the Russian government might actually agree for that, but would he agree? Because you can't legally, at least so far, they might change the laws. They've been changing them all the time now, but it's not clear if at this point you cannot legally kick out a Russian citizen out of the country without his consent.
Andres alluded to something here that I'd be interested in hearing Robert and Yeshua on it as well, which is the question of middle class flight, which affects China and Russia and a number of other places now, and is different from previous eras where things went in this direction. In that it's, as Andre points out, Russia has not made it impossible for the middle class, for members of the middle class with enough money and connections to leave for exile. China has made some efforts, but it still isn't impossible. And it creates an interesting phenomenon of great benefit to countries like Canada that basically have built themselves on the flight of the middle class from countries that have turned authoritarian. And I was in Russia at the beginning of this pandemic in February and March of last year, both doing some university things and interviewing working class families in places like Nizhny Novgorod and other industrial places. And I hadn't really been for more than a couple of days for a decade. And I was struck by this in Russia, that all of the middle class people, all of the more university educated people I encountered seemed to have some escape plan or iron in another fire, or way to get out somewhere, or some cousin in New York or Toronto that they were keeping things close to. Everyone was keeping their passports updated, which hadn't been the case before. And I certainly see that when I'm in China now too, and not just in Hong Kong, in the first tier cities, is that everybody's making sure their money's out. Everybody who's middle class in the North American sense of middle class has an escape plan. So this is both a different dynamic within these countries because the middle class can get out, but of course it also provides some regime stability, I would imagine, because those who would otherwise dissent are getting out. And I think about like the Euro crisis at the beginning of the last decade, when in previous economic crises in Europe, young people who were jobless and had no hope would have revolted and overthrown their governments. And that didn't happen in Europe very much, or at all in 2010 or thereabouts, in large part because EU internal mobility. All the young people who would have revolted against their governments in previous generations, they all went to Germany and France and Britain and got jobs. So I wonder if getting back to Robert's point, if the maintenance of the human mobility aspects of globalization is partly an aid to the sustenance of some of these regimes. It acts as a pressure relief valve for potential dissent.
Well, I would say, I mean, historically that's been true. Cuba, Castro would periodically, in great waves. East Germany had a whole complicated system of ransoming and people escaping and then being ransomed, and it's a way to earn money and also be the escape valve and so on. And that was an interesting strategy. I think you're quite right. In Greece and Spain, where unemployment was really high among youth after the Great Recession, people picked up and left, and there was a migration of, I mean, they're probably working middle class, maybe not. It's hard to say what the class is, but it's people, underemployed people, youth, and so on. In Tahrir Square, in the same period, the unemployed youth went into the streets and overthrew the regime, but they didn't really do that so much. I mean, some of that in Greece, but they didn't manage to really overthrow the regime in a dramatic way, nor it was clear that they wanted to. But I think Russia and other places do sort of use that as an escape valve, and that people are looking to do it. The trouble is, of course, is that it's one thing to take your person and your skills. It's another thing to take your money. And I think China is very worried about capital flight associated with that, and the oligarchs and the people, the big companies and the rich part of the ruling class defecting with their cash and outsourcing their money, not just their luggage. So that's a different sort of thing. It seems like that's probably not so. I think Russia has probably already dealt with the oligarchs in that fashion, right? They've either gone away and they've seized their property, in which case they don't have any, although they took a lot of money with them at the time, but they didn't manage to, take the whole hog. So I think it's a good point that that's a strategy that many regimes are using. And sometimes, I was struck by, there's a migration stream, for example, from Israel, of young people who move, of all places, to Berlin. It's like, what? But there's a large Israeli community now in Berlin, which is a largely response to the political character of the stuff. It's a dissent type movement rather than simply like, oh, we want to go party in Berlin or something. So it's a good point.
I know some of those Israelis, and it includes a large number of people. And yeah, it is. I was at a gathering and I asked a couple of them, including a historian, don't you feel a little uncomfortable their answer was incredulity. They're like, these are people in their 40s and 50s as well. No, of course not. All my friends in Israel feel jealous that they can't get a visa and that sort of thing. I suppose technically they all can actually, but they don't have the connections and whatnot. Anyway.
Also seeing it in Thailand. The trending hashtag right now is Leave Thailand.
Mhm.
And it's mostly college-educated youth who are trending this hashtag because they were involved in street demonstrations against the political structure as it currently exists in Thailand, and particularly reform of the role of the monarchy in politics. And that has been, it's not a game over yet, but the large numbers that they were able to mobilize, they haven't been able to mobilize now for a while. And some of them are feeling it's time to throw in the towel and try again somewhere else. And I don't think it's not like a situation in Cuba or something like that where the regime lets somebody go, but the regime certainly benefits in Thailand when those people go.
Why?
So,
You mean they're less?
It's a voice of dissent that's leaving. It's a voice of dissent that's leaving. So they are making their own decision to do that, but the regime would be the beneficiary of that.
When they leave, they're taking human capital with them. So yes, they take their dissent with them, but they also take a lot of goodies with them. Personal, qualities that I would think Thailand would like to keep. No?
Well, one would like to believe that, wouldn't we?
Okay.
I think that we might be facing a situation where, this gap will begin to grow because of all the human capital that, that is moving. And so, while the regimes will be able to maintain themselves and that using this as one of the tools to maintain themselves by, letting dissent out, they will also, in the long run, it's going to weaken their standing because the countries will lag more and more and more behind. And I don't know what that's going to lead to in the long run, but I think that if you can count the gross product that is being produced by people that left Russia, in the last decades, is something like $1 trillion or something. I don't know how you can evaluate that or not.
One of my friends teaches half the year in the Higher School of Economics in Moscow and half the year in the criminology department here. And he surprised me the other day when he said that he's teaching courses in English in Moscow. And I said, that must be a rare thing. No, he says all universities now, they are internationalizing to the extent of actually teaching courses in English. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean that they're trying to placate the people who would like to leave, but somehow don't really want to take the bold step of leaving, and they'll left and pretend to be Americans and Canadians and so on by speaking English at home? Or does it mean they're trying to keep them there? Or does it mean these guys are preparing to leave? Or what's the connection between these two things, the migration out of middle-class people and the growing tendency to have international education in the universities there?
The university you mentioned, HSE, has a lot of independence from the politics of the country. So, but there's English classes everywhere, and everybody's learning English. I do wonder about the brain drain aspect of it. I remember at the height of the Euro crisis in 2010, I was in Greece, and I forget who it was. It was a politician I was talking to, and I said, is it a concern that all of your economy is sort of moribund old companies, and there's not a lot of startups or entrepreneurship and that sort of thing? And he said, "Oh, are you kidding? Greeks are leading in startups and high-tech industries and entrepreneurship and all that stuff. And I said, really? And he said, oh yeah, you look anywhere in London or in San Francisco or New York, there's a Greek guy who's running one of the leading edge companies and that sort of thing. Just they're not doing it in Greece. And you certainly hear that in, I think Andre would agree, in Russia now too, that that there's been a big drive for the last 20 years to try to get Russia beyond resource extraction and diversify its economy with some success. But you increasingly see that Russians who have ideas and want to do interesting things that get beyond resource economies are choosing to do it in the United States or in a European capital or in Canada or something like that.
I would say that the first decade of the century was a decade of fast economic development in Russia, and when there were many opportunities, people were excited. There were actually a few years when there was a overall inflow of capital, at least according to the official statistics. Of course, that was to a certain extent related to high oil prices, but that clearly was not the only explanation. The second decade was a decade of stagnation, basically. There's very low growth rates or no growth or very low. And while, the political system, the authoritarian political system consolidated, third decade that we're just, beginning to experience will probably, we'll see kind of a slow decline, and the slope will probably become more and more steep at the year after year. I think there will be stagnation, will be slowly transforming into a decline, and maybe a more rapid decline toward the end of this decade.
I would agree with that. I think that's true. The other thing I would say is that, Meta, we were talking about globalization, and one of the, I think Russia speaks to this, is that one of the great failures of globalization is the integration of Eastern Europe. I mean, the integrated Eastern Europe, but not Ukraine or the former Soviet Union, into a capitalist economic system that's part of this global network and so on, and with capital flows and commodities and economic production and supply chains. That effort largely failed. And the inability of the EU to extend itself to Ukraine, and Russia's determination to kind of go it alone as a resource-based, economy with actually relatively little connection to the world economy, and in terms of investment or any production of goods and services and so on, and participation in the high-tech development like China has. And so that's actually, in some ways, unglobalization starts early in that part of the world. There was an effort to it that, under Yeltsin and stuff in the 90s, and they were going to integrate in the market transition, and they were going to join the world economy like everybody else, and then that just didn't happen for a variety of reasons.
I would add that actually the first maybe 4 or 5 years of Putin regime, there was, or of Putin's rule, it wasn't a consolidated regime then, there was lots of that going on. And I think there was a change somewhere in the middle of the first decade, ideological change that was to a certain extent provoked by the fact that the West didn't provide enough support or enough attention, and did not maybe regard Russia, didn't at least there's some issues that Russia was raising weren't taken serious.
You're right. I think there was a real disappointment, and the disappointment can be measured. If you look at Russia in that period, maybe $9 billion of direct foreign investment. At the same time, China's getting $52 billion. China hogs all the capital available, around the world, and Russia is disadvantaged by that. So it was never forthcoming. We invited China in, and we helped China get in and integrate in this globalizing thing. But the United States and Western Europe did not do that with Russia. And even, the Germans spent all their money on the integration of East Germany, not on the integration of Eastern Europe and the Ukraine or the Baltics. So that money was just not available to us to help globalize Russia in that way, and I think, a big disappointment.
There was a real failure during that key moment in the first half of the 2000s, and I think both Russia and Turkey were victims of this. And you can credit some of their turn away from liberal democracy, I think, to that. I remember in the early 2000s, in the early years of Putin's first presidency, I would meet with generals in the Russian army who would quite frankly and openly say to me, I expect within the decade Russia will be a member of NATO, and we're working on this assumption because we're growing more integrated. We share similar threats, which were then regarded as being threats from Islamic countries to the south, and not only would we consider being in the EU, but NATO is a real possibility. Now, I don't know if it ever was a real possibility, but the fact that that was a sort of normal language among the military elite and the political elite suggests there was a possibility. And you heard that in Turkey at that time too, during Erdogan's early years. It was fully expected that Turkey would become a member of the EU. One of the reasons why people put up with Erdogan's party was because it was the Westernizing, Europeanizing party, and the secularists were very against Europe and global trade and those sort of connections. And there was sort of a moment in the mid 2000s when the United States and Western Europe, as Robert says, dropped the ball on the countries to the European periphery, and turned on Turkey with the French and German leadership's statements about Europe being a Christian continent and all this sort of stuff. The United States during the Bush years really kind of turned away from any interest in expanding that team. I often said that if the project for the New American Century, which was the neoconservative movement that guided people during Bush's first 4 years in office, if it had called itself the Project for the New Democratic Century and had exactly the same views, it might have had buy-in from a lot of these countries on the edge. But you could just feel it around 2004, 2005 of a just dropping Russia and Turkey and probably some other peripheral places, Ukraine as well, right? Yeah. Off the edge. You can see it in Serbia stayed a lot more stable throughout a lot of the intervening decade, in part because it was the one country on the periphery that was they kept an on-ramp to potential EU membership going for Serbia. And that meant that even when you had pretty extreme governments elected, they stayed in the lane, because they knew their voters wanted to eventually have the ability to have bank accounts and work and travel in the neighboring countries. And I've often thought if Ukraine and Turkey had been granted those sort of distant hope on-ramps, that things might have gone better, but I don't know.
It's not just about the economy. It was also largely due to political issues. For Russia, for example, I think a critical mistake was made in 2008, in beginning of 2008, when major European and the United States and other countries recognized the self-proclaimed independence of Kosovo. And, there was kind of a rule that you do not recognize self-proclaimed independence, at least on the European continent after World War II, unless there's some kind of a agreement, with the relevant government of the state and so forth. So this was really, they said, we'll do this as an exception, but this should not be a precedent for anything else. Well, you can't do that. They opened the Pandora box.
And I was in Russia at the time, and I really felt that that was the last straw that really changed the attitude and the behavior of the Russian elite. We got the war between Russia and Georgia just about 6 months after that happened. And of course, then now we have the war in Ukraine. And I'm sure that neither of these wars they simply wouldn't happen had it not been for that move, because maybe something else would happen. But this was really a blow. I don't think people in the West understand. It seems like a minor issue. It was a very major issue that had a critical effect on the way events turned in Russia and in this part of the world in general.
Fascinating. Well, we see the results, because I think there's a very asymmetrical attitudinal change or relationship. The Russians are much more hostile to us than the rest of the Western countries, at least the ones I know of, feel toward Russians now. Is that true?
Well, that's you should make a difference between the Russian people and the official propaganda and all that, because I think of course people have been brainwashed, but at the same time many people still travel to the West to keep their bank accounts, and the Russian elite, much more I think than the Chinese elite, is actually integrated in the West. So it's kind of a very awkward situation.
Thank you. We've covered the waterfront, I think, the whole globe today. So thank you all. It's been fun. See you again.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you, Meta. Thank you, everybody. That was great.